This good, and then you'll. Alrighty. Well, welcome everybody to the Thyroid Talk. Decode your thyroid, why you still feel off. And like the name mentions, we're going to talk all about thyroid today. And we're going to talk about why you may have gone to the doctor and they ran your thyroid labs and everything looked normal and you still feel terrible. Or maybe they ran your thyroid labs and things were off and they put you on a medication called levothyroxine. Maybe they put you on Armour Thyroid or liothyronine and you still feel off, even though you're taking the medication. So today we're going to dive into what the thyroid is, how it functions, what the feedback mechanism and loop looks like. We're going to talk about the 4 different questions that need to be addressed when we are looking and understanding what's going on with the thyroid. And we're going to talk about things that you can do to support your thyroid naturally and what labs need to be run if you want to properly understand what's going on with the thyroid. So if we're going to discuss the thyroid, we of course have to talk about what the thyroid does in the body. This is where I typically do a big Q&A, but there's no one in the office right now to do a Q&A with. So we're just going to kind of jump into some of this stuff. So kind of the main things that the thyroid does here, controls body weight, controls breathing, controls cardiac function and heart rate. It's going to control and cause issues with the hair, digestive system, heart health, cholesterol levels, central and peripheral nervous systems, muscle strength, menstrual cycles, body temperature, digestion, bone health, and calcitonin, and development and IQ. So it's a pretty extensive list. Immune system is the last thing on the list there. So the thyroid really touches all of these different systems in the body. And that's why it's one of my favorite hormones and one of my favorite systems, because the thing with the thyroid is it acts globally. It acts on all the cells. It actually goes into the cells and acts on the nucleus and the DNA and increases metabolic processes because of an increase in gene transcription. So thyroid hormone has these effects on all the different systems in the body, which is why, number one, it can be so frustrating when your thyroid's not functioning properly. And it's also why it can be so hard to diagnose or figure out what's actually going on, because symptoms can range so drastically, right? The main things we're going to see, people with hypothyroid, this is going to be people who have trouble sleeping. You're tired and fatigued all the time. We've got difficulty concentrating. We've got dry skin and hair loss. Is going to typically happen with hypothyroidism, hyperthyroidism, because there's a lot of overlap in the symptomatology between hypo and hyper. So hypothyroid is going to be more hair loss, whereas hyperthyroid is going to be really thin and brittle hair. With hypothyroid, we're going to have depression, whereas hyperthyroid is going to be more of our anxiety type patients. Hypothyroid, constipation. Hyperthyroid, we're going to speed up all of our digestive processes, and a lot of times we're going to have loose or runny stool. Hypothyroid, sensitivity to cold temperatures, because if we can't raise that metabolic process, our body can't generate heat to keep us warm when it's cold outside. Frequent and heavy periods, and then it can cause a lot of joint and muscle pain. So if we contrast that here with hyperthyroid symptoms, this is going to be trouble sleeping. Hypothyroid, and I didn't really talk about this with sleep issues, is going to typically be a difficulty falling asleep, whereas hyperthyroid is going to be a difficulty staying asleep. So we're going to have restlessness. We're going to have a rapid heart rate. We're going to have anxiety and irritability. We're going to be hot all the time. We're going to have sweating issues. We can have tremors, some loose stool, weight loss, weakness. With the hair, we talked about hypothyroid is the hair getting really like just falling out in clumps. Hyperthyroid is going to be more thin skin and hair. And then this is going to be heat intolerance because the body's running at 100. We're already super hot. Our metabolic processes are already really sped up. So when we go into a warm environment, we're just feeling even hotter. So it makes it really uncomfortable, especially places like Florida. Now, hypothyroid is going to be the most common. That's where people are getting put on levothyroxine, as we'll talk about. It's one of the most commonly prescribed medications. But hyperthyroid can happen. And maybe you're someone who says, well, I have all of these symptoms, or some days I feel like this and other days I feel like this. Well, we'll talk about what that means today as well. It's typically going to be more of an autoimmune condition where the state of your thyroid depends on the activation of the immune system. And so all of those different symptoms can give us clues as to what's actually going on. So before we jump into and talk more about the thyroid, we're going to just start with a little bit of a story here that's going to set the scene and the stage for what we do in our office and how that differs from what you've typically seen with your thyroid and when you go see your endocrinologist. So imagine you're out to dinner, you pull into your driveway, house is on fire. First thing we're going to do, obviously, jump out. We're going to call 911. And the reason we call 911 is because the people who are going to respond to that call are the professionals who have the tools and the training to put the fire out. So the firemen are going to come. The first guy's going to run up with an axe. He's going to start chopping down your door. The second guy is going to come in with a fire hose, and he's going to start spraying everything inside the house down. Now, question, is any of that actually good for the house? The answer, of course, is no. Water is not good for your couch. It's not good for your pictures. It's not good for your walls. But when the house is on fire, do we really care about any of that? No, right? That's why we called the guys with those tools, because they put the fire out. The question then is, once the fire's out, we're standing in front of it, and the house looks like this. Now, obviously, you can't go back inside. You can't get your stuff. It's dangerous. You could die. You could get hurt if you walk back into that house. And if you ask the firemen who put the fire out and just saved your house what they have to say and how they're going to address this moving forward, they don't really have any options. They're patting themselves on the back because they did a really good job. The problem is that we're still living now in a house that we can't occupy, right? So the next morning, we got to call the next guy, and we're going to call the carpenter. Different training, different set of tools, looking at the exact same situation, but instead of thinking, oh, what a great job I did, they think, oh, I got to pull everything out of here. I got to strip everything down to the studs. I got to bring in new drywall, new carpet, new couch, new kitchen, new appliances, and completely rebuild the house. And the difference wasn't the house. The house is the same. The difference is the training and the way that they're looking at the situation and the problem and how you're going to move forward. So when we talk about this, the medical system is going to be your fireman approach. If you're dying, if you get seriously injured, if you have an acute illness or an acute injury, that's exactly what the medical system's there for, to save your life and to make sure you don't die. Once we've established that you're no longer dying, the tools and resources that they have aren't going to help make you healthy again, right? And so that's where we come in. We're looking at things differently. We want to understand how your body's adapting and responding, why it's working the way it's working, and how can we help to support normal health and rebuild your house so you can live in it. So when we talk about this, specifically as it relates to the thyroid, we've got the medical approach. We've got the firemen here. The firemen, when they look at your thyroid, they're going to run a couple things. So they're going to run TSH. And a lot of times they'll run TSH with what's called a reflex to free T4. And that means that if TSH is out of range, and only if it's out of range, now they're going to run your T4 levels. And this doesn't unfortunately give us a whole lot of information, but it does give them the information that they need to diagnose you with hypothyroidism, right? And that's really what they're looking for. So a TSH test is usually used as the initial blood test to detect hypothyroidism. The doctor may need to order additional tests to diagnose hypothyroidism. They may also check your levels of free T4 thyroxine, which is the amount of thyroxine in your body. It's important to know that blood tests are not the only way a doctor determines your hypothyroidism diagnosis. Asking how you're feeling is just as important. And I'm sure a lot of us know, if you're watching this, you're probably frustrated with the testing that you've had done. Sometimes you just go in, you say, I'm tired and I'm gaining weight, and they won't even look at your hormones. They'll just give you a medication. And we'll talk about an actual research study that they did that talks about the medicalization of supplements, and not supplements, but of medications, and how some doctors are using these medications outside of what they're normally prescribed for. So they ran your TSH, they ran your T4. What's next? Well, we saw if you have hypothyroidism, what's going to happen is your TSH typically is going to increase, your T4 will be lower, and you're going to get put on a variety of medications that are a synthetic version of T4. So this is going to be Synthroid, levothyroxine. This is T4 only. And when we talk about this in a couple of slides, we'll talk about kind of the active hormone versus the produced hormone. And so the active hormone T3 is actually not in this medication here. The other thing we look at is a lot of the side effects of thyroid hormone are going to be things like irregular heartbeat, chest pain, muscle weakness, nervousness, irritability, difficulty sleeping, weight loss, changes in your menstrual cycle, cramps, headaches, impaired fertility, all of those things that sound a lot like the hyperthyroid symptoms. And this is really where we start to see issues is people are over-medicated or they're being given a medication that they don't actually need, and it ends up creating the opposite problem. And in this case, that would be called iatrogenic hyperthyroidism, which means the medication actually induced a new problem. And so this is why it's so important to understand what's actually happening with the thyroid so we can make sure that we're taking the correct approach and we have the correct plan for you moving forward. So this is kind of where we're at right now. Previously, when I've done this talk, I had always used the 2020 ranking here of medications, where we saw that levothyroxine was the second most prescribed drug in the United States. At this point in time, there are about 99 million prescriptions a year to about 20 million different people. So it was an extremely prevalent medication. Now, thankfully, we've seen that number actually decline through 21, 22, and 23. It dropped to the third, fourth most prescribed medication. And in 23, we saw a slight bump back up to the third most prescribed medication. So this is a huge issue. If we look at what that looks like, we saw kind of a huge bump over 100,000 or 100 million prescriptions in 2015 and 16, a slight dip kind of back up, and we're hopefully going to continue trending on this path where we aren't prescribing as much of this. And so you may say, you know, it looks like we're moving in the right direction. Maybe people are getting healthier. Maybe we don't need as much thyroid medication. But the big thing is that I think thyroid medication came out. It was touted as this miracle drug, and everybody started prescribing it, and it actually became overprescribed. And so looking at some of the research that they did on kind of why there's a downturn in some of the trends, they're actually not prescribing it as frequently for people. And previously, they were just jumping on and prescribing this to anybody. And I think they've slowed down a lot on prescribing it to people who don't have overt hypothyroidism, which honestly is a really good thing. And then there's also trends, you know, we're not putting as many people on it, which is great, but we're also taking some people off of it. So they've actually recognized, especially in elderly patients, that kind of tapering off of the thyroid medication is important. This article right here in the endocrinology and metabolism, one of the things that they had mentioned was the reasons that doctors are kind of reluctant to take people off. And a lot of it was that they just didn't have time to have the conversations with it. They didn't understand the tapering protocols. But the other one that I thought was really interesting was that a lot of the patients give them pushback because the patients become emotionally attached to the thyroid medication. And I think a lot of that is just people don't know what's going on with their body. And when you don't know what's happening with your body and you feel sick all the time, then you start clinging to the answers that you've been given. And so that's one of the reasons that I want to kind of do this talk, is to educate and empower people so you can actually understand what's going on with your thyroid. So the next approach here, say you have been down this route, you're put on the medication didn't really help, or you didn't want to have to take medication for the rest of your life. And so you went to more of a functional medicine doctor or a naturopath or a DO, or somebody who you were hoping was going to run additional labs. Now, a lot of times they will actually run additional labs. These people are going to typically run TSH, they'll run your T4, they'll run your T3. And if you're lucky, they might actually look at your antibodies as well, which helps give us insight into some of the destructive issues that are going on or some of the autoimmune conditions that we may have. The problem is that their solution oftentimes is the same, right? So they're seeing that your hormones are low, and they're going to give you something to increase your hormones. Now, in these situations, a lot of times they're going to be using desiccated thyroid hormones, things like Armour thyroid, Nature thyroid, which are a little bit better because those are going to have T4 and a little bit of T3. They're also going to have some of the other cofactors and trace minerals that we need for optimal thyroid function. So it's better. They're not going to have the dyes and the synthetic things either, but it's still the same approach and philosophy. It's we were low on hormone. Instead of asking why we're low on hormone, we just gave the body more of it, and we're hoping that that's going to fix the problem. And so that's where kind of in our office, we take things a little bit further, and we want to ask why. we understand your body was designed to function normally. And so the symptoms that we see, what we're looking at on labs, that's your adaptation and it's your response. And so we want to listen to the adaptations, we want to listen to the responses and understand why those things are happening. Because when we know why the body's adapting and responding the way it is, we can come up with a really good plan to fix it. And it all starts with supporting what the body's already trying to do and then fixing the stressor that the body's adapting and responding to. And so if we want to think about that with a thyroid, we first got to take a step back and just say, okay, how does the thyroid even function just from a basic level? So the way it works is a really cool negative or positive feedback loop. So the hypothalamus, which sits right up here in the brain, releases a hormone called TRH, which is thyroid releasing hormone. That goes to the pituitary. The pituitary releases another hormone called TSH. You may have heard TSH because I just talked about it. That's the first hormone that a lot of your doctors are going to run. And oftentimes, unfortunately, it might be the only hormone that they run. So you look at TSH, which, mind you, wasn't even produced by the thyroid. It's produced in the brain here in the pituitary. TSH is going to stimulate the thyroid. So that's what it is, thyroid stimulating hormone. It's going to tell the thyroid to produce a variety of hormones, mainly T4. About 80% of what comes out of the thyroid is going to be T4. And the other 20% is going to be T3, maybe some trace amounts of T1 or T2. We'll talk about that, but those aren't going to be important. It's mainly T4 and T3. T4 and T3, when they elevate in the blood, is going to send a signal back to your thyroid and your pituitary, or your hypothalamus and your pituitary, and say, hey, we're good. We've got enough thyroid hormone. You can stop making it. And we shut this response down. Thyroid levels drop, or there's a stressor that comes onto the body that requires more thyroid hormone to adapt and respond. Those levels are going to start to go up again. So the whole thing's a feedback loop, which is why we have to have all the pieces to the feedback loop if we truly want to understand what's going on with the thyroid. So there's 6 main hormones that are made by the thyroid. One of them is produced by the parathyroid, which sits behind the thyroid, but we're going to just lump those all together. So we've got T4, T3, a really cool hormone called reverse T3, T2, and T1. And so if we want to understand how all of this works together, we've got to first understand T4 or synthetic T4, the levothyroxine you're taking. It just doesn't replace all of these. So there's 5 main hormones that are produced by the thyroid, one by the parathyroid. And that medication that you were put on, it only replaces one of those, and that one hormone isn't even the active hormone. So if we want to support what's actually happening from a functional standpoint, we have to look at the greater picture. And this is where asking more questions is super important. So there's 4 main questions that I alluded to that we have to ask and look to understand about the body if we want to know what's going on. So the first question is, do we have a production issue? And this is just straight up, do you make enough hormone? Is your thyroid actually producing T4 and T3? If it's not, then something like levothyroxine or Armour Thyroid is going to help in this situation. Now, like I had mentioned before, we're the carpenter doctors. We typically are people's last stop. Somebody who has just a straight production issue is probably not going to be the person that ends up in our office, just because they're the ones that were put on the medication. It replaced what the body wasn't producing, and now they're good. The caveat is for the people who don't want to be taking medication, people who believe their body was designed to function normally, and they want to get off the medication, well, we've got to solve the production issue if you want to get off the medication. But typically, production issues are not going to be the people walking into our office because they feel way better when they take the medication. The second question is, do we have a conversion issue? Because we already said T4 is not the active thyroid hormone, even though it's the most produced hormone. That's actually T3. And so we've got to make sure that we're actually converting T4 into T3. And if we're not, our T3 levels may be low, even though T4 and TSH look normal. And that's what we refer to as a conversion issue. The third question is, do we have a destruction issue? This is going to be our autoimmune conditions. This is things like cancer and nodules and things like that, where the thyroid tissue is physically getting destroyed. A lot of times this will cause a production issue, but it's not solely a production issue. So a lot of times these are going to be the people who are taking the medication, and every year they go back and their hormones look worse and they have to get put on more and more and more medication because the medication isn't touching the destruction issue. All it's doing is addressing the lack of production, which just continues to get worse when the destruction continues to take place. And then we've got interference issues, which is where something else in the body is triggering the problem and triggering the thyroid issue. We'll talk a lot about hormones and how hormones play a role in thyroid receptor activity and transportation in the body. And if our hormones are off, our thyroid's going to be off as well. So We're going to break this down, but it talks about all the cool different things that can impact production and how we can work to support it from a nutrient standpoint, and things that cause conversion into reverse T3 and into T3, and things that affect uptake of T3 into the cells and utilization by the cell. So that's really what we're going to talk about today, is how to identify what problem we have by looking at your blood work. And then once we've identified the problem, how can we work to support the body, remove the cause of the problem, and then support that healing response, make sure your body has all the nutrients it needs to function normally. So the first issue, which oftentimes is the simplest issue, is do we have a production issue? And what this is going to look like is higher levels of TSH, low levels of T4. If they actually checked your T3 levels, they could be normal, they could be abnormal, they could be low. This is kind of up in the air. If it's a straight production issue, typically we're going to have high TSH, low T4, and low T3. And what's happening here is, if we think about that feedback loop, the body's recognizing that there's not enough T4. It's trying to signal the thyroid to produce more T4, and so it has to increase TSH. So it's like the brain is yelling at the thyroid to produce more hormone, but the thyroid can't, so the levels keep dropping and the brain keeps yelling louder. That's why we see those TSH levels come up and the T4 levels come down. So there's a lot of factors that can contribute to this. Number one is, if we think about, if we're trying to build a Lego house and we don't have any Legos, and mom and dad are yelling at the kid because the house isn't done, but the kid doesn't have any Legos, mom and dad are just going to keep yelling and the kid can't do anything about it. So the Legos that we need for thyroid production are tyrosine and iodine. T in T4, T3 stands for tyrosine, and the 4, 3, 2, and 1 stands for the number of iodine molecules that are bound to it. So we've just got to have those. It also takes a lot of cofactors to run the pathways that build those hormones. So we've got to make sure we have iron, iodine. We talked about iodine, zinc, selenium, vitamins E, B, C, D. There's a ton of others. But we've got to make sure we, at the bare minimum, have the nutrients that we need to support production. If we look at what it takes to make thyroid hormone, this is one of my favorite graphics. I nerd out all the time about the thyroid. But it starts with T1, which, if we're trying to build a T4, it makes sense that we start with T1, right? So T, again, stands for tyrosine. We've got the tyrosine molecule right here. That's an amino acid. Then we've got these deiodinase enzymes that are going to come on, and they're going to bind an iodine. So we take a T, a tyrosine, with an iodine, and we call that monoiodotyrosine, or T1. Now, to get to T4, we've got to have T2. So T2, we're going to bind another iodine. Pretty simple. Tyrosine, 2 iodines. What you may be thinking is, to go from T2 to T4, we got to go T3. And actually, that's not the case. What actually happens is we bind 2 T2s together to create a T4 molecule. And then to get to T3, we remove, oh, there we go. This is T4, 2 tyrosines. And then to remove it, we got a T3. Now, the way the body works is that these kind of unlock and they go into receptors. There's receptors in the nucleus of the cells that are specific for T3. And if we think about that as the receptors a lock, this is the key. The key fits in the lock and it opens it because of the shape of the key. And the important thing to understand here is the shape of the key. We removed this iodine. We did not remove this iodine. What can happen under times of stress, low-calorie diets, inflammation, toxic exposure, vaccination, all sorts of things, is that we can actually remove this iodine. And if we remove the bottom iodine, we create a hormone called reverse T3. The key is shaped differently. It doesn't unlock the lock, and we actually deactivate the thyroid hormone. And this is a really cool protective response. And if we haven't evaluated your reverse T3 levels, we have no idea if your thyroid hormone levels are low out of protection or if they're just low across the board. So this is something that's really important to look at on blood work, is our reverse T3 levels here. So let's talk about the building blocks. Tyrosine, non-essential amino acid, which means that your body can produce it. Comes from the Greek word tyros, which means cheese. So, like you can imagine, cheese is a pretty good source. Animal products are really good sources of this. Making sure you have plenty of chicken, turkey, fish, things like that in the diet. You can read this whole list. You can go to Google. You can type in high food sources of tyrosine. We don't need to jump into that, but making sure you're incorporating plenty of those foods into your diet is super important. Iodine. Iodine is one that everybody knows about for the most part. We all think about iodine. We think about iodized table salt. And what was happening was that they were realizing that in these low iodine areas that people were getting these big growths on their neck. They were getting goiters because the thyroid tissue was enlarging, trying to produce more hormone. And when they gave iodine, the goiters actually went away. And so they started adding iodine to our salt. However, iodized table salt is not the best form of iodine. Iodized table salt is bleached. It's got anti-caking ingredients in it. They stripped all the other beneficial minerals out of the salt. And oftentimes what happens is that iodine will actually evaporate off of there. So that salt that you found in the back of grandma's pantry that's been sitting there since 1984 actually has very little iodine in it. So the best sources of iodine is going to be anything that comes from the sea salt, seafood, sea vegetables. It's also high in things like cranberries, strawberries, eggs, turkeys, and prunes. So we do want to make sure that we're getting plenty of iodine. Your thyroid can actually concentrate blood iodine levels up to 260 times the level of blood if we're trying to produce a bunch of hormone. So there is a ton of iodine that gets concentrated up in that thyroid. It's extremely important to take iodine if we're trying to support thyroid health. If we look at labs, excuse me, if we look at labs, this is a very, very extreme example here of what a thyroid production issue looks like. I want you to ignore everything else. This is an interference issue, not just a production issue, but the production component, if we ignore everything else, so you just went to your doctor who ran your hormones and all they ran was your TSH and T4, you've got a TSH level of 150, which should be like 1.25, so like 100 times higher than we should be for TSH. And we've got a T4 level of 0.3, which should be right around 1.25. So we're very, very high in TSH and we're very low in T4. The brain is screaming at the thyroid to produce hormone and it's just not keeping up. And so, like I said, this is a much more complicated issue. We'll talk more about this in the interference issues. But this is a perfect example of a production issue here. So the second question here, what does a conversion issue look like? We talked a lot about this. Conversion issues can be one of two things. Number one is we could just not be converting T4 into T3 or reverse T3. We're just not able to get that iodine off the molecule at all. Or we could be converting T4 into reverse T3 instead of T3. The only way to know which one of those issues you actually have going on is to measure TSH, T4, free and total T3, and your reverse T3. You got to look at them all at the same time if you want to understand what's happening there. A lot of the issues with conversion come from deficiency in cofactors. So if we don't have enough zinc, selenium, B vitamins, or glutathione, we can't get that conversion to happen appropriately. We could have gut imbalances or liver function issues because the gut and the liver is where a lot of that conversion takes place. We could have a cortisol issue. If we think about like cortisol increases metabolic rate, so does thyroid hormone. So if our cortisol is through the roof and our metabolic rate is super high already, the body doesn't want two things taking us in the same direction. So deactivate your thyroid hormone as a protective response. We've also got methylation issues. And I wanted to talk a lot about this, but we don't really need to talk about it. There's 3 different enzymes that remove iodine molecules. There's D1, 2, and 3. D1 is going to mainly remove, not mainly, what D1 does is it works in the body as a whole to remove the iodine from T4 to make it T3. D2 is going to remove the T4, the iodine to make T3 in the cells specifically, in specific places like the thyroid tissue, liver, brain, really, really important vital structures. And then the D3 is going to cause that conversion to reverse T3. So depending on the environment of the body, you're going to have varying activity and levels of those 3 different deiodinase enzymes. And that's one of the big things that's going to cause this conversion here as well. So that's why we've really got to look at lifestyle and factors. We can't just look at blood work and then try to manipulate it because those enzymes are being expressed at different levels on purpose. Your body's not dumb and it didn't make a mistake. It's trying to protect itself and it's trying to adapt to the environment. And so we've got to look at this and just say, what is the body trying to tell us about what's happening? If we look at a thyroid conversion lab here, again, there's antibodies here, there's other stuff going on, but in this case, we've got a low level of TSH, we've got a high level of T4. If you just, and this is one of the cool labs here, if you just ran TSH and T4, what you're going to think you have going on is hyperthyroid, right? So hyperthyroid, high T4, so there's high circulating levels of T4, the brain's trying to quiet down that thyroid, so TSH comes down a lot, but we've got a conversion issue here. So T3 is actually low. So we're not converting into T3. And when we go a step further to ask why are we not converting into T3, we can see we have higher levels of reverse T3. Now that did not get flagged as being high, but it's on the higher end. T3 I typically want to see in the mid to low teens. That's at 22.7. So what's happening is this is a stress response. It's a low calorie diet response. It's an immune response. There's something else going on here. And we just need to look at this and say, we don't need to give your body something to kill the thyroid, which is unfortunately a lot of times what they'll do is they'll put you on a medication that deactivates the thyroid follicular cells. We don't want to do that. We want to actually encourage our T4 to convert down into T3 instead of converting into reverse T3. Next question we got to ask is, do we have a destruction issue? We've got some hints at this on the last two pieces of blood work that we looked at. This is where we're going to have antibodies. Now, we could also have cancers and tumors and cysts that fit into this category. But for the sake of argument for today, we're going to talk about antibodies because that's what we see most frequently. The main antibodies we're going to have are thyroid peroxidase antibodies or TPO antibodies. That's going to impact the ability to move iodine molecules around. And then we're going to have thyroglobulin antibodies, which impacts the transporters for the hormone. We may also see, because we're chiropractors, we take a lot of x-rays. We'll take a lateral cervical film, which is a side view of the neck. The thyroid's right here. And a lot of times when we start to have inflammation and destructive processes taking place, you can see calcification on the thyroid gland. A lot of people will tell you it's normal. It's common, but it's definitely not normal. And it's an indicator that there's a functional problem that's starting to take place there. And so we can start to see that. And then destruction issues, we can have hypo or hyper values. It kind of just bounces back and forth. The big thing here we're looking for is, do we have antibodies? The antibody that's not listed on here is thyroid stimulating or thyroid stimulating immunoglobulin antibodies, or TSI. And those are antibodies that can stimulate the thyroid to produce hormone outside of the feedback loop of TSH, and that can actually cause hyperthyroidism. So if we have antibodies present and we have hypothyroidism, we're going to get diagnosed with Hashimoto's. So that's an autoimmune hypothyroidism. If we've got antibodies present and we have hyperthyroidism, we're going to have Graves' disease. They're both just autoimmune hypo or hyperthyroidism. But regardless of which one of those things is going on, anytime we see antibodies present, we know 100% it's an immune system issue where the immune system is going after the thyroid. And then we have to ask, why is that happening? The medical system will tell you that that's happening because the body made a mistake. We don't believe the body makes mistakes. We believe it adapts and responds in a very powerful and important way. We want to understand why that's happening. And so our philosophy is that, maybe the thyroid's not actually attacking, or the body's not attacking healthy tissue. Maybe the thyroid tissue is actually not healthy to begin with, and the body's trying to clean that up and do something about it. And so that's where looking deeper at other things is really important if we've got autoimmune issues. And a lot of times you'll be told that there's nothing you can do to reduce your antibody levels, and I'm going to show you a lot of labs. I'll show you a lab where we see those antibody levels come down drastically when we make the proper lifestyle changes. Autoimmune issues are a huge issue. We talk all the time about the leading causes of death in the United States: cardiovascular disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, metabolic diseases. Autoimmune diseases don't make that list because there's hundreds of autoimmune diseases. However, when we lump all the autoimmune diseases into one underlying mechanism of immune system dysfunction causing an antibody response in the body, it actually breaks into the top 25 for middle-aged females. So this is an extremely important thing to take a look at. And I think we don't get a lot of attention to this just because the medical system hasn't really identified this causes this. They don't really have great treatments for it. And when you break all these different diagnoses apart, they just don't add up to be as much of an issue as some of the other things. But when we put them together, they break actually into that top 10 of all-cause mortality. So it's super important that we take a look at this, especially for females. So something triggering the immune system, triggering the destruction of tissue. The antibodies formed in the thyroid gland destroy thyroid function. Okay, so this could be a production issue, but it's not actually a true production issue. It's caused by a destruction issue. So this is a great example of a patient that I was working with. And I'm still continuing to work with. She's had thyroid issues. She's been on levothyroxine. I think she was on Armour thyroid for a long time also. When she first came in, and not even when she first came in, this is from April of 2025. This is just a couple months ago. Her thyroid peroxidase antibodies, which that normal range for thyroid peroxidase and thyroglobulin antibodies is less than 15 or less than 30, depending on the lab. She was at 13,000, and she was actually above 13,000. And this is when she was taking medication. And so she was taking medication. She was still dealing with all of these issues. And her thyroid peroxidase labs were over 13,000. Her thyroglobulin antibodies were at 1,300. And so we started working on stuff. We'd been working on stuff for a long time at this point, and her thyroid peroxidase levels hadn't changed. And she actually decided to come off of her thyroid medication because she was getting really bad acne and sleep issues and stuff. And I was like, it sounds a lot like hyperthyroidism. The symptoms she was exhibiting weren't hypothyroid, they were actually hyper. So this was iatrogenic hyperthyroidism. This is the labs after she came off the thyroid medication. It was the first time in over a year that we saw her thyroid peroxidase levels come down. She was at over 13,000. She went to 356. We tested it 2 months later, and she had continued to come down to 345. And her thyroglobulin antibodies had gone from 1364 into the 550s. That is an insane, insane change. I mean, that's like a 20 or 30 time decrease. No, it's not. It's like I can't do math right now. It's not important. 13,000 to 356. And she was told there was nothing she could do about it, which is very frustrating. The most frustrating thing was that she had come off her medication in this time, and that's the big thing that caused her thyroid hormone levels to change. So having the whole picture here is really important. I blocked this out because we're going to talk about that in a little bit here. So the last question we've got to ask here is, do we have an interference issue? So this is really where kind of the wellness way approach is so awesome, because we're not looking at individual systems, we're looking at the body as a whole. And with an interference issue, it's a whole body issue. So it could be a nutrition issue, it could be a stress issue, we could have heavy metal toxicity, we could have mold and biotoxins, food allergies, high viral load, gut issues, immune system issues, molecular mimicry, hormone imbalance, pituitary gland issues. There could be all sorts of things that are impacting and affecting the thyroid. And the reality is, I almost never see somebody who's got a thyroid issue who doesn't also have some of this stuff going on. And that's the unfortunate part about the world we live in, is there's a ton of emotional stress, there's a ton of chemical stress, no one's doing what they're supposed to do, and no one's got the right advice to help people. And everybody's body is so different. If we don't test for this, we don't know the specific advice that you may need. And so that's really where testing comes in and is so cool. This is a perfect example of an interference issue. So if we just, again, look at TSH and T4, we're kind of low across the board. And we say, well, that doesn't make sense. If T4 is low, why wouldn't TSH be high? So right away, we have a lack of proper feedback here. We've got T4, T3 that are, or T4 total and T4 free are low. But then, wait a minute, T3 is high. That doesn't make sense. Well, why would T4 be low and T3 is high? So there's a reverse conversion issue where we're over converting into T3, and reverse T3 is super low. These labs, if you just look at them from a thyroid feedback loop, make no sense, which automatically tells us we've got an interference issue. The good news is we have no antibodies, so at least we can rule out autoimmunity. But in this case, we have to dig much, much deeper to really understand what's happening in this case. So the first thing with an interference issue is, if we go back to our Legos and we've got our building blocks, we got to have iodine. Iodine is super important. And I don't want to get super into the periodic table, because this may bring back some PTSD for a lot of people. But we've got the halogen group right here. Iodine sits right here. We've got bromine, chlorine, and fluorine that all sit above that. What that basically means is that when they get into the thyroid gland, fluorine, bromine, and chlorine are going to have a higher affinity to bind to tyrosine than iodine is. And so this gets back again to our autoimmune issues, where we said maybe the immune system didn't make a mistake. Maybe it's responding to the environment of the thyroid. Well, what happens if the thyroid absorbed a bunch of chlorine? Because maybe we swim in a chlorinated pool all the time, or maybe we don't filter the chlorine out of our water. What if there's a bunch of fluorine in there because we're constantly brushing our teeth with fluoridated toothpaste, which we know is a neurotoxin? What if there's bromine because we sleep in a room where we got fire retardants and stuff all over? Maybe we drink a bunch of soda that has bromine in there. Maybe we've got bromine in the flour, brominated flour that we're eating all the time. These things are all over the place. And if there's excess of those, there will be competitive inhibition within the thyroid for iodine, and we won't even be able to produce T4 because we have so much other stuff that's circulating around that thyroid gland. So it's really important to make sure, number one, we're removing these other halogens from our diet and from our lifestyle as much as we can. Big thing with fluoride is toothpaste. Toothpaste is kind of a, like fluoridated toothpaste is a really hot button debate, because you've got your dental people that tell you that you've got to put fluoride in your toothpaste and you've got to put it in the drinking water because it helps to prevent cavities. And the thing is, they're not wrong. Fluoride will actually compete out and build a stronger enamel on your teeth. There's not really a debate on whether or not it does that. The question is that more important than its negative impact on the nervous system and on the thyroid? And that's where you've got to make up your own decision. But you can't let the teeth debate cloud your judgment when it comes to your thyroid health and when it comes to neurotoxicity. The reality is there's other things that you can do to protect your oral environment. You can chew xylitol gum, which prevents cavities because it reduces the staph aureus in your mouth. You can brush your teeth with hydroxyapatite toothpaste that kind of remineralizes the teeth. There's a lot of stuff that you can do from a lifestyle standpoint to remineralize your teeth. It doesn't have to be fluoridated toothpaste. And I would argue that if you have a thyroid issue going on, we 100% should be filtering the fluoride out of our water, and we should be using fluoride-free toothpaste. The next one is bromine. Talked a little bit about this. Soft drinks, methylated bromide, brominated flour. It's also used as a fire retardant. So all of the stuff in our house that we don't want to catch on fire is off-gassing bromide a lot of times. The fabrics, the carpets, the upholsteries, the mattresses. A lot of people will use bromine in their pools. In their hot tubs. I know growing up in Ohio, we had a hot tub and we didn't want to use chlorine, so we used bromine instead. But the reality is it's just as bad. It's just a different chemical. And then chlorine, obviously the big one is pools. But chlorine in drinking water is super bad as well. When we first moved into our house in Lakewood Ranch, we had someone come out and test the water. And actually said the chlorine levels were twice the legal limit for a swimming pool, which is crazy. But what will happen is people don't like the taste of their water, so they call up the sanitation department and they say, all right, well, we'll just dump a ton of chlorine in it. And that'll basically nuke the taste of the water, kill all the bacteria, which is great. We're not getting listeria and all of these like waterborne third world country issues. But now we've got all these other issues that are popping up as a result of it. So filtering the chlorine out of your water is super, super important. The good news with chlorine and fluorine filtration is that at least like the refrigerator filtration systems will at least pull the chlorine out. They're not going to pull the other stuff out, but they will at least get a lot of that chlorine out of your water. The other one, which thankfully we're not doing this as much anymore, is the mercury amalgams. So mercury is a heavy metal. It's toxic. They put it in the amalgam fillings here to strengthen that amalgam. The problem is that we know now that heat actually increases the vaporization of mercury. And so those mercury fillings, every time you chew or eat something hot, it off-gasses that mercury and it gets absorbed straight into the thyroid in your neck there. So if you have mercury amalgam fillings, it's really important that you get those taken out. The way that you have to get those removed is through the SMART protocol. So you have to typically find a biological dentist that will utilize that SMART protocol, which I believe is a safe mercury amalgam removal technique, SMART, to get those out. Thankfully, they were not using them. I had to get a couple fillings in my mouth, and I asked, you guys don't use the mercury amalgams anymore, right? And they were like, no, they're not really used at all anymore, except in like low-income areas. And I was like, well, what the heck? That doesn't make any sense. You know these things are bad. You're not going to give them to people who can afford fillings, but the people who can't afford fillings are going to fill their mouth with poison. I was like, makes no sense. So this is a video, smoking tooth. So they've got a tooth with a mercury amalgam. The guy basically rubs it with a pencil eraser. I don't know if you can see it in the video, but you can see the gas kind of coming off. That's the mercury vapors. Here you go. You see the mercury vapors coming off of that tooth right there after he rubs it with a pencil eraser. So it's kind of crazy that if you have those amalgam fillings in your mouth, that's what's happening whenever you're grinding and creating friction or when you're eating something hot. We know thyroid hormones, there's negative associations between mercury levels and it's directly thyrotoxic. So we want to make sure we're getting the mercury out of our system. I actually recently ran a test that looked at heavy metal toxicity in my body, and I had high mercury levels. So I was running down the street and grabbing sushi a lot, and I was eating a lot of tuna. So I have since stopped eating as much tuna because those mercury levels were kind of disturbing how high they were. And I try to take good care of myself. Selenium, super important. Mercury will actually impair selenium activity, which is not a good thing. Selenium is what creates the selenoproteins, which are extremely important antioxidants within the thyroid. So one of the other cool things about the thyroid, depending on how you look at it, is whenever we produce thyroid hormone, we create free radicals that can actually damage the thyroid. The good news is the body's super smart, so we have these selenoproteins, which actually offset the damage that's created when we produce thyroid hormone. So this is really important. Anybody who's taking iodine, it can upregulate thyroid hormone production. And if we upregulate thyroid hormone production, we can upregulate the oxidative stress on the thyroid. So don't ever take iodine without also taking selenium to help offset that damage that can be created. One of the other interesting contraindications, which I've never met somebody who was told before they were put on levothyroxine that adrenal insufficiency is a contraindication, but it is right there. It's literally on the contraindication package that comes with the levothyroxine. This just happens to be from Thyroid, which is the brand name for levo. But uncontrolled or unaddressed adrenal insufficiency. How many people who have thyroid issues have actually been addressed or had their adrenal insufficiency checked? Usually not very many. But that is something that we can look for. So there's a couple different tests. We can test cortisol levels through either saliva or through urine. That's kind of the gold standard. We look at it in blood a lot of times, but that doesn't give us the whole picture. We want to look at those free cortisol levels in blood or urine or saliva. In this kind of reference range here, it should be high in the mornings. It should come back down. It should kind of follow this black line here. What will happen is people who are really, really acutely stressed out, we're going to see their cortisol levels live at the top of that graph. And if they've been really stressed out for a long time, like what they were talking about on the back of that package with adrenal insufficiency, that's going to be all the way down here. And so if your hormone levels live at the bottom of that range there, then you're somebody who's directly contraindicated to take levothyroxine, which I'm sure most people who are taking it have not had that tested. So this is a perfect example. This is someone who has, they're fading fast. So this isn't pure adrenal insufficiency, because when they wake up, they're really high here. This is more of our patient who wakes up in fight or flight. They've got kids running around like crazy. They got to get out the door really fast. And all of a sudden the kids are gone and they just absolutely crash. And you can see instead of coming up in the morning, their cortisol levels actually tank. They pretty much stay low the whole night. And a lot of times this is what we call wired but tired, or tired but wired, where you're so tired you actually just can't fall asleep. It's a really big indicator that something significant is going on under the surface. We also look at this. This is a Dutch test right here. This can tell us what's going on between cortisol and cortisone, which gives us a better understanding of what's happening from an inflammation standpoint in the body. If we have a really high preference for cortisone, a lot of times that can be associated more with inflammatory conditions or autoimmune conditions. This patient is just pure dead, no energy all day long. And all of a sudden, they feel ramped up at night. This is another wired but tired situation, but instead of waking up anxious with a ton of energy, they're waking up barely, super fatigued, can't get themselves up and moving, can't get energy throughout the day. And then all of a sudden, kids come home, husband comes home, they're trying to wind down and go to bed, and they get this burst of energy. That's this patient right here. The other thing we talked about from an interference standpoint is understanding estrogens and estrogen metabolism. Estrogen plays a huge role in thyroid regulation in the body, and estrogen can actually impact receptor binding sites and transporters for thyroid hormone. So if estrogen levels are off, it can impact your thyroid's utilization in the body, even with normal thyroid levels. So you could have an estrogen imbalance and you could feel like you have all the issues that go along with thyroid hormone dysfunction. And you go to your doctor and they look at your thyroid and they just tell you your labs are fine, even though you feel terrible. And they just tell you it's all in your head, or go take an antidepressant or go exercise. When in reality, you have an endocrine disruption or a hormone imbalance that's driving that thyroid dysfunction. And that's where looking at hormone pathways and hormone metabolism pathways in the body can be super, super important. When we talk about immune system issues, we talk about like what's triggering and stimulating the immune system. And foods can be a huge part of that. So we look at IgE reactions, which are going to be the immediate inflammatory responses that happen as a result of food. So this is like eating a peanut, throat closes up, breakout in hives, all that type of stuff. And then we talk about the IgG reactions. This is where we focus a lot more in our office. This is going to be the food sensitivities or intolerances, We refer to them all as food allergies. They all fall along that hypersensitivity reaction scale. They're just happening through a different set of antibodies. And so when we call these food sensitivities or intolerances, we basically are down-regulating, or we're downplaying the response that's happening in the body. But the reality is, every time you eat a food that creates an IgG response in your body, you're creating cellular damage, you're creating an inflammatory response, and you're stimulating the immune system. And oh, by the way, this makes up about 70% of the immune response. So we tend to respond to significantly more foods, which means we're creating that response in our body all the time. When we run these, this was my own personal test result. I had 29 IgG reactions. These were things I was eating all the time. Things like coconut. I actually forgot I had a coconut allergy. This was back in 2022. Eggs, kale, lettuce, milk, rice, chia seeds, hemp seeds, tuna used to be on there, wheat. There's all sorts of things that you would think are healthy that you eat all the time. The benefit is that this can change. The test I did after this, I only had 6. Now I have 13. So this is a really good picture of like how the gut's responding and how your immune system's being activated. Yeah, so here's a year and a half later, I went down to 6 food allergies. And this is basically an indicator of leaky gut. We know that leaky gut is caused by environmental toxins, stress, medications, drugs, all sorts of different stuff. And this we know leads to autoimmunity. So if you've got an autoimmune condition, you haven't looked at your gut, you're missing the bigger picture of what's going on. Even a lot of the medical text now is referencing leaky gut as being a precursor to almost all autoimmune conditions. So looking at gut health is super important. When we look at x-rays, because again, we're chiropractors, take x-rays on people, we actually see a lot of inflammation in the gut. This is a patient who's got a lot of bowel gas and bloating and inflammation and stuff going on there. You can see all the bloating here with that stomach protruded out right there. So this is something where we can start to, as soon as you come in and we do x-rays, you can actually start to see a little bit about what's going on within your gut environment there. We don't need to talk about that. So let's talk about measuring your thyroid. We talked about a lot of different hormones today that we are all important to look at. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, produced in the pituitary. That's basically telling your thyroid what to do. We've got our total T3 and total T4. This is the total amount that's being produced. What we didn't talk about is the binding globulins that transport the hormone from where it's produced to where it needs to go. And that's kind of the difference between the total amount here and the free amount, which is actually what's available to be used. Someone can have a totally fine total T4, but a low free T4, and they're still going to feel bad and have all the symptoms of hypothyroidism because all of that thyroid hormone is actually bound up to globulins or transport proteins in the blood and can't be used. We've got reverse T3, which we talked a lot about. We've got resin T3 uptake, which is looking at the receptor sites and the availability. So if that resin T3 uptake is higher, it means there's less binding sites that are actually available to be utilized, so that even if we have normal thyroid hormone levels, we're going to feel hypothyroid because we just can't use the hormone appropriately. Thyroid binding globulin, these are the transport proteins we talked about. Thyroid peroxidase antibodies, thyroid globulin antibodies, and the thyroid stimulating immunoglobulins. Those all tell us there's a destruction issue. Cortisol, super important to look at cortisol, again, to address adrenal insufficiency. So we always look at it in blood on any thyroid panel, but looking at it in urine or in saliva is really the gold standard there. So if you feel like we've got adrenal insufficiency, we'll want to run additional testing beyond just blood work to address and look at what the adrenal glands are doing. Ferritin levels, looking at your iron storage and iron reserves is super important, especially because iron plays a big role not only in production, but also in conversion. Vitamin D3, super important, especially in autoimmune conditions. About 92% of Hashimoto's patients have vitamin D levels under 30. So it's incredibly significant to understand where those vitamin D levels are at. Now, that being said, the research doesn't necessarily support that just taking vitamin D is going to reverse your autoimmune conditions, but there is a huge correlation between low levels and autoimmunity. So we can't just run and take a vitamin D supplement and expect it to fix all of our issues, but it is a really important thing to take a look at. So hopefully this helps you understand a little bit more about thyroid, whether we have a production issue, conversion issue, destruction issue, and interference issue. So if you've looked at this and you're feeling a little bit frustrated because you haven't had that stuff checked, that's totally normal. Almost nobody who comes into our office brings us labs that are thorough enough to really understand what's going on. And it's to no fault of anybody. The question is just, now that we know what we need to look for, what's the plan going to be moving forward? And how are we going to take steps now to better understand what's happening with our body? And so if you're feeling frustrated, if you're looking for a different approach or a different solution, we'd love to help you take the next step. And that's kind of what our new patient evaluation does. We can do that in the office. We can also do that virtually. We have patients all over the country who we work with virtually. And really what we do is we start with just a 40-minute conversation. We want to hear what you've been through, hear what your story's like, and help kind of figure out what that path forward needs to look like, what type of blood work we need to run, whether we need to look at the gut, whether we need to look at hormones, whether we need to look at the adrenal glands and cortisol levels, get the testing back, understand what's going on, how your body's adapting, how it's responding, and how we can best support your health moving forward to get you back on track. So if that's something that you're interested in, we are running a $99 new patient special through the end of the month. It's part of our Black Friday deal. So you can reach out to the office, you can schedule online, and we'd be more than happy to sit down with you, hear what you've been through, hear where your health is at, and help you kind of navigate that plan moving forward. So hopefully you guys enjoyed. I don't know if we have questions from online tonight. Quiet bunch. Cool. All right. Well, y'all take care.